What's up everyone, it's That Weekend Warrior. If you've been following the channel so far, you'll know that I collect toys, video games, records, and more. But one of the challenges in being a collector of those items are the prices. Some of those things are just crazy expensive. But with toy lines like Star Wars, Masters of the Universe, Ghostbusters, Ninja Turtles, we're getting retro versions back on store shelves at a more reasonable price. So my question is, vintage versus retro. Does the higher dollar amount equate more nostalgia and joy versus the retro toy that is almost identical? Let's get into it. So a few years ago, I got back into collecting toys more heavily, and it started with Star Wars. I went into a shop out here called Echo Based Collectibles, looking through their Star Wars section, and I came across the Star Wars Retro collection. Now, if you've not seen these, they're awesome. They look exactly like the original Kenner toys from the 80s. The difference is, of course, is that the card has like some weathering to it, like in the design, and there's this big red badge on the top that says Retro. But depending on where you go, these figures retail about 15 to 20 bucks, which is great when you consider, say, for example, the Bespin Luke, which is one of my favorite figures, on card is like $300, like if you can find it, right? But if you find them loose or whatever, like most of the that I've found have been like $50 or more. They've been like heavily played with, it's missing accessories and so on. So the question that always comes to mind when I'm purchasing some of these is that having the retro, does that bring me joy and nostalgia as much as if I had the original, right? And so this has always been the toss-up with me when it comes to these toys. Star Wars is like really gone crazy with all of their retro collection, right? So they've kind of Kennerized or retroized, if you will, all of their properties. So like The Mandalorian, like all those figures have that vintage Kenner look, and Rogue One and Andor and all the Disney properties that they're doing right now, right? Which I think is awesome. Like I love that style, I love that vibe, and it brings back that nostalgia, right? But Kenner's toys from the 70s and 80s, and I have friends that are exclusively only purchasing those vintage toys, the prices are insane, right? So again, it comes to the question, is like, does nostalgia equate a dollar amount? Or is nostalgia and joy about the figure and being able to buy the figure and looking at something that, even if it's retro, gives you the same feeling you did as a kid? He-Man and the Masters of the Universe is one of the first toy lines that I remember that my parents bought me a lot of. And I mean, I had a lot of it. It's not just figures. Like I had Castle Grayskull, I had Battle Cat, I had Point Dread, and other vehicles. And I have no idea where they went. Like just poof, they're gone. So in my sadness, you know, I started looking at the cost of potentially replacing just mainly the core figures and everything too. And then I walked into a store a few years ago and I saw that Mattel had released the MOTU Retro Plate figures. These are cool, but I don't think they're as good as the Star Wars Retro collection. Specifically when it comes to He-Man himself. His face and hair are very different than the vintage toy, as well as his build. Like I know they've added extra articulation for the figure and everything like that, but he's slightly leaner. Like He-Man and most of that line were very beefy. But the other figures in the line, Castle Grayskull and vehicles, are pretty close to the vintage. Now, this is where I'm probably going to sound a little contradictory, because I'm very content with the retro collection stuff of Star Wars, but when it comes to MOTU, like it's up here behind me, like Grayskull looks great, like it's a great display piece and everything like that. I want that vintage toy. The reduction of articulation and He-Man being the back the way he was, specifically the face. Like if the retro play, like the face mold looked exactly like the one we had from the 80s, maybe I would just be content with that. They did do the Masterverse 40th anniversary He-Man, and it has that face. It's like, why didn't you put that on that figure? But because of that, like the vintage toy in this situation, I want it. I definitely want to buy a vintage He-Man, Battle Cat, and Skeletor. And of course, my personal favorite of the retro style toys to have come out are the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Now, the vintage Turtles really are not that bad in price. There's some figures in the line, like especially later in the line, like Scratch the Cat, that can really get up there in price because of the limited amount that they made. But like if you're comparing Star Wars vintage to Ninja Turtles vintage, it's not really an apples to apples comparison in price. However, like if you're looking for carded turtles, especially let's say the original 10 back. If you didn't know, the original TMNT released had 10 figures on the card back. 4 Turtles, Splinter, April, Shredder, Foot Soldier, Bebop, and Rocksteady. But what makes these even loose, a little bit more sought after, is they had soft heads. Like Bebop had a pink head, for example, and as they changed later on, they had the hard heads. So when comparing the vintage to the retro, they're super close. There's subtle differences. Say for example, Donatello is a dark brownish green in the retro line, where he's a little bit lighter in the vintage line. However, one thing I love about the retro line is that whatever material they're using for the heads and the paint job, it makes it look like the soft heads. But when we're doing a comparison of vintage versus retro, this is one of those situations where it's passable. They look so similar. And have them on card, like I have the 4 Brothers, I have the storage shells, and I have the large turtles. They look great. And it didn't cost a ton of money to buy them as well to have them on card to display. Now, everything I've been talking about is completely subjective. It's just my opinions. I'm a toy hunter, toy collector, whatever you want to say. But one thing I've been fortunate about is a lot of my toys from my childhood survived. Like I have vintage Star Wars, I have vintage Ninja Turtles, I have some vintage He-Man. Don't know where all of it went, but I do have some of them still. The conversation between vintage versus retro really comes down to you. What do you want to do? I just wanted to shed some light on the comparison of if you're looking at a retro figure versus a vintage figure, they're very close. If it works within your budget and it's what you want to do, I think that's what all that matters. There's no right or wrong answer. Just do what makes you happy. Thank you all for watching. Please let me know your thoughts on the conversation of vintage versus retro. Don't forget to subscribe and click that bell when I drop new content. You can also follow me on social media. Check the description for my links. Until next time, be good.